What I was asked to do is not to give a formal lecture that has a sort of beginning and an end and an argument, so much as to talk about why I wrote a history of the American Whig Party, and it is the American Whig Party, not the English Whig Party, and what some of the more interesting or surprising things were that I discovered when I was doing my research. And that, indeed, is what I want to spend most of my time on this evening. But there may be people in this audience that don't have a clue about what the Whig Party was. So I think I'll say something about it before I describe my book. I realize that many of you do probably know what it is, but for those that don't, it would be helpful. The American Whig Party was created in the winter of 1833-34, and it disappeared essentially in 1856. While it existed, it was the political home of people like Henry Clay and Daniel Webster. Abraham Lincoln, the future Republican president, was a member of the Whig Party during its entire existence, but so was Alexander H. Stephens, the future vice president of the Confederacy. He was a loyal Whig, too. We can think of it as the predecessor of the contemporary Republican Party as the major rival of the Democratic Party in American political life, although, interestingly enough, it was quite different in its relationship to Democrats than the Republicans in the Democratic Party today. The Whigs, though the preferred party, easily the preferred party of the vast majority of the economic and social elite in the country, were the party of big government, the party that wanted to use the government to do things, to develop the economy in order to create greater economic opportunity for individuals, to improve the nation's moral tone by chartering, by having public school systems, by having religious-oriented reform, whereas the Democrats in the antebellum period and throughout the 19th century, for that matter, were the group that always opposed big government. They opposed the use of government for almost anything other than wars of foreign expansion. They were big fans of that, or removing Indians from lands. But so you have a real flip-flop. The Whigs were the guys that wanted to use government, and the Democrats were the party that resisted the use of government. Although the party's existence was quite brief, 22 years, it won 2 of the 5 presidential elections it contested. It competed quite evenly with the Democrats in congressional and gubernatorial elections during its history, and it also helped generate levels of popular political interest and voter turnout that really do reveal how anemic political life and interest is today. This was a very different world that these parties operated in. The turnout level in the 1840 presidential election, for example, was 80.2% nationally. It was higher than that rate in 15 of 25 states. It went down to 79.8% in 1844, still pretty high. It plummeted all the way down to 72% in 1848, and at the lowest point it was 69%. We've been barely able to scrape by with over 50% voter turnout in presidential elections for the last, I don't know how many years. It was also very extraordinary in gubernatorial and off-year congressional elections, 65 to 70% turnout rates. People were really interested, and the Whig Party, by what it stood for, helped generate this interest, this level of participation, which, as I said, really shows how anemic our political culture is today. And the Whigs managed, along with the Democrats, obviously, they helped achieve this level of popular interest, not by pursuing some goody two-shoes policy of bipartisan cooperation with the Democrats, Let's get together and solve problems for the public interest. They achieved this level of turnout by opposing what the Democratic Party stood for as ruthlessly and as relentlessly as possible. So we come to another kind of difference of 19th century political culture and life today. Commentator after commentator today says the reason people are so turned off by politics, the reason they don't vote, is that they're sick and tired of all this partisan feuding. They just wish the parties would get together and address public problems and solve them. But it's demonstrably clear, however, that in the 19th century, the only reason why there was this turnout level was precisely because there was so much conflict and such sharp partisan differences. It was the conflict between the parties rather than their cooperation that produced public interest in politics. In my book, and it's a very long book, I must say, if anybody's tried to pick it up, let alone try to read it, I attempt to tell the story of this party from its birth, or its origins really, before it came on the scene, to its death and displacement in the presidential election of 1856. Because state governments actually had more impact on people's everyday lives in the antebellum period and for much of the late 19th century as well than did Washington. It's a story that I attempt to cover politics in all the states as well as on the national scene. It focuses on both the internal divisions within the Whig Party, a very shrewd person at Brookings Institute named James Sundquist once wrote that political parties should be conceived of as battlegrounds over which contending factions fight for control. Every party has battles going on within it to get control of it, and I try to pay attention to that, as well as its external relationship of competition with the Democratic Party. I try to trace the ebb and flow, or the rise and fall of what I call centrifugal forces of divisions within the party that were always threatening to tear it apart, and the relationship of those divisive forces with the centripetal force that held the party together, that gave it coherence, and that centripetal force was always hatred of and conflict with Democrats. It was the function of opposition that held the party together. This book is not only long, in many ways it is quite intentionally a very old-fashioned book. It shuns postmodern theory and jargon. In 1,200 pages, I never once mentioned Foucault or Habermas. At the risk of political incorrectness, it focuses almost exclusively on dead white men. It closely examines events, contingency, cause and effect sequences, and change over time. In short, unlike so much of the academic history that's written today, it is a traditional chronological narrative based on such unsexy sources as public documents, congressional records, newspapers, and politicians' private manuscript collections. But my mining of these sources was quite extensive, and in fact took me almost 25 years altogether to research and write this book. I began the research in the fall of 1976. I began writing in the fall of 1981. The book came out last May. You can add up the time invested yourself. I mention these things to help explain why Daniel Walker Howe of Oxford University, in one of the book jacket blurbs on the back of the book, credits me with both perseverance and what he calls intellectual courage for defying current academic fashions. The cold fact is that traditional political history, like my book, has been scorned by the majority of academic historians for at least 20 years. That fact raises two obvious questions. Why would Oxford University Press ever agree to publish a book that would be unfashionable in academic circles? And for that, I'm hoping that my editor, who really helped me out, Thomas Levine, who was my editor at Oxford, I was hoping he could be here. I don't see him, but it's a little dim in the back of the room. But I owe a great deal of thanks to him for getting them to publish it. But the other question that this raises is, why on earth would I spend so long on a book that I knew that most of my colleagues in the historical profession would greet with yawns of indifference, if not worse? And believe me, I've been getting worse from some of them. Why aren't there more about women and everything? One answer is that, believe it or not, that is why I wrote it, this is the first full-scale history of the Whig Party ever written. There have been lots of biographies of different Whigs and state studies, but nobody ever attempted it. Another is that when I decided to write this book in the early 1970s, and this is a long time ago, political history that focused on public policy and policymakers and political organizations had not yet been so completely relegated to the fringes of academic history by historians of women, children, racial minorities, gender, sexuality, the working class, various discourses, so-called subaltern groups, and many other trendy topics. Now, granted, I had no idea whatsoever that this book would take me 25 years to write. Only a fool or a masochist would undertake a topic that big to take on. But once I got started, I was too stubborn to stop. But yet another answer of why I took this on is that from the start, I in fact had no intention of engaging in some kind of arcane narcissistic debate with fellow academic historians. I wanted to try to communicate as clearly and as interestingly as possible to a general public, that is, to people like you. I don't know whether any of you have bothered to read this, but that was my attempt. I was hoping to... I must say that one of the things that's bothered me for a long time, but it's particularly bothered me now that I'm a chairman of the department, is precisely the too much history that's written. Too many of these monographs are going to have a readership of maybe 25 people. It's such an in-group. They're aimed at all this. They're talking to each other and not to a broader public, which is what I think historians should be doing. The book I produced is, in fact, not the book I set out to research and write. That's one reason why it's so much longer and took so much longer to write than I anticipated. What interested me most about the Whigs was the death of the party, not its life. My original plan then was to focus only on the party's last 12 years, starting with Henry Clay's narrow but heartbreaking defeat and the presidential election of 1844, and then trace the party's last dozen years to try to explain how and why this party died. Earlier books and articles I'd written on the rise of the Republican Party in the 1850s and on the Know-Nothing movement of that decade, that nativist, anti-Catholic upsurge in the middle of the decade, had convinced me that the collapse of the Whig Party was an absolutely critical link in the chain of chronological events that led to the outbreak of civil war in April 1861. And I've been spending my entire professional career teaching and talking about what caused the Civil War and why it came, and I've always argued that one has to be able to explain why it occurred when it did, and when you ask that question, why it occurred when it did, it's clear that there is a demonstrable chain of of events that were linked to each other. If you think, when did the Civil War start? Well, why did it start? It started because of the firing on Fort Sumter and Lincoln's call for 75,000 militia on April 15th. After that, why was Fort Sumter fired on? It was fired on because 7 Deep South states had seceded. It couldn't have happened without secession prior to that. Why did those 7 Deep South states secede? Because of the election of Abraham Lincoln on November 5th, 1860. Why was Lincoln elected? Among other things, he was elected because of the creation of the Republican Party in 1854 and 55 and its rise to power between those dates in 1860. How could the Republican Party be created and rise? Well, one thing that was absolutely necessary for the Republican Party to be created was the disappearance, the displacement of the Whig Party, and hence the death of the Whig Party. Why it died or was displaced is an important link in this chain of causation that explains why the Civil War occurred when it did, and that's one reason why I was interested in this question. Yet there was another reason why this topic interested me. Although the Federalist Party of the 1790s and the early 1800s was probably the party that I have the most intrinsic feel for, I guess, empathy for, had also disappeared during its fitful existence. In those years, it had never developed the organizational base or the widespread popular allegiance in the electorate that the Whigs did. Thus, the Whigs are arguably the only mass-based political party. That is, a party that could get 1 million or more people out voting for it. The only mass-based political party in all of American political history to die. And I wanted to find out why. My increasing disenchantment with both the contemporary Republican and the contemporary Democratic parties in the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s only increased my curiosity about the death of the Whigs. Why, I repeatedly asked myself, are we seemingly stuck forever with the modern Democratic and Republican parties when the Whigs, a party I could genuinely admire, went out of business? That just didn't seem fair to me. And I want to say that this is not simply a hypothetical question. I gave a lecture in London back in 1990 called The Mysterious Disappearance of the American Whig Party, in which I tried to use an explicit comparative examination to show why it is so puzzling that a major party dies. One comparison was with the British Conservative Party of the 1850s, but the other was with the Republican Party in the 20th century. If you look at the condition of the Republican Party in the 1930s, in terms of the share of the popular electorate it drew, in terms of the share of seats in the House and the Senate, the share of governorships, it was far weaker in the 1930s than the Whig Party ever was, yet the Republican Party survived. Or the thing that interested me the most was actually, if you look, and I kept a file of newspaper clippings on this, on what was being said after Watergate. And there were all these predictions that the Republican Party was going to be displaced, that there was going to be a new conservative party or something else. One of the Republicans I genuinely liked, Senator Mathias of Maryland, even said, if the Republicans don't look out, they're going to go the way of the Whigs. That is, disappear altogether. But obviously, they survived. But it wasn't just the Republican Party. After George Bush's election in 1988, when it appeared the Democrats would never again win the presidency, people started talking, and believe it or not, about the Democratic Party dying or being displaced. A reporter from the Christian Science Monitor came down to interview me about, can the Democrats actually die? Can they be displaced? But perhaps the height of my fame, I'm thinking of Tom Fleming, my graduate student here. It gave me a certain instant panache among the graduate students at Virginia. Some guy from Rolling Stone magazine interviewed me about, is it possible that the Democratic Party is going to die? And I'm quoted in Rolling Stone, and this made kind of a cult figure among students. In any event, why the Whig Party suffered such a different fate from the Republicans of today, or the Democrats of today, was the question that got me interested in writing this book. But when I sat down to write, I couldn't write one background chapter that got me up to where I wanted to start, so I decided I had to write the history of the whole party. So what were the most interesting things I discovered while researching and writing the book? I can't hope to summarize everything here, but I do want to focus on a few things, and particularly the things that I found most surprising. And here I am going to have to inflict some detail, some historical detail on you that may be quite unfamiliar. But one of the things that was not a surprise to me, but I found most interesting, and this is not historical detail, but I would hope it would be of great interest to those of you. I understand there are many high school history teachers and principals in the audience. One of the things I found was how easy it was to enlist the energies and talents of my undergraduate students at both Yale and the University of Virginia. I taught at Yale for 8 years before I went to Virginia, in writing research papers that I could use, that were really useful to me, in writing the history of the Whig Party. And these were, juniors and seniors, not too far away from high school. Kids, if you show them, boy, there's a question out there, and it's an interesting question, and there's room to find information for answers, you can get these students to do almost anything, and it's a terrific thing to remember. In fact, so I cite a lot of undergraduate seminar papers in my endnotes and bibliography, and indeed, I have to say that one of the greatest pleasures that I've had since the book came out was the number of letters that I received from former students, some of whom I taught over 30 years ago, congratulating me. Indeed, one of my favorites is from a guy named Bob Hample, who said, who I taught in a seminar and then was his senior thesis advisor at Yale, and he said, "I'm leaving money in my will, although I hope it's not cashed in soon, to Yale University to be used to support research on senior theses because of working with you on mine." And I thought that was great. That's a very kind of flattering thing. But one thing that did surprise me as I researched this book is how wrong I was about how so many things. In an earlier book I'd published that covered much of the same chronological period, a book called The Political Crisis of the 1850s that came out in 1978. I readily confess my earlier mistakes in numerous endnotes in the Whig book, but the fact that I made them does punctuate the need for historians to keep digging deeper in the sources they use in order to get the story right, and I consider that a salutary lesson. This point leads to yet another thing that surprised me during my research. I was stunned, and I have to say increasingly dismayed, to discover how many really reputable historians, in fact, don't go back to the original sources. Historians as reputable, let's say, as David Potter in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Impending Crisis. They instead rely on secondary works and what other historians have said as the gospel, and they get things wrong. Let me give you a specific example here. One of the most famous pieces of legislation or packages of legislation enacted during the period in which the Whig Party existed was the so-called Compromise of 1850. You all remember what that is. California comes in as a free state. Territorial governments are organized without slavery. In Utah and New Mexico, the boundary between Texas and New Mexico is settled at the modern border. There's a harsher Fugitive Slave Act, and the slave auction is banned, not the slave trade, but the public sale of slaves in the District of Columbia was prohibited. Those were the main parts of this. Almost every historian writing about the Compromise of 1850 says that the wording of the territorial bills for New Mexico and Utah were identical. And they argue about whether or not this was really popular sovereignty, as the term was. How much authority would territorial legislatures have over slavery in these territories? And I think the reason why all historians say this is that an historian named Holman Hamilton, originally in a document collection that Leonard Levy and Merle Peterson edited called Major Crises in American History, had a section on the Compromise of 1850, and he reproduced this territorial legislation, or supposedly reproduced it, and then he wrote a book called Prologue to Conflict, in which he also had an appendix, the wording of these bills. What I discovered was, in fact, that Holman Hamilton had it wrong, and thus everybody that relied on him had it wrong. That there was in the New Mexico bill a 19th section, and you say, well, what difference does this make? Well, the wording of this section was very interesting. It said, no citizen of the United States resident in said territory can be deprived of life, liberty, or property except by the judgment of his peers or the laws of the land. Well, the laws of the land then opens up all kinds of things. What kinds of laws apply? And this was not in the Utah legislation. So then I wanted to find out, well, how the heck did that ever get in the bill? And how did I find, well, let me tell you first how I found out about this, and then explain to you how I found the origins of this. I discovered this fact in an undergraduate seminar. I mentioned these papers that I had students doing, that I taught for a number of years on the Compromise of 1850. And the assignment for the first the first 3 years I gave it, was that I told each student, you pick a state, and the delegation, the congressional delegation from a single state, and I want you to follow through both the representatives and the senators from that state, see what they say in debate. This happened to be the longest session of Congress held prior to the Civil War when this compromise was passed, and then see how they vote on this legislation, find the patterns of divisions within the delegation from those states, and then go back to newspapers and manuscript sources and explain the divisions you found. This was the main task they did. But as a part of a sort of a writing exercise, I always had them as well, and again, I know I'm getting into detail that may be unfamiliar to you. I said, I want you to write a 5-page paper that analyzes the differences between what Henry Clay proposed on January 29th when he presented this compromise plan, or in the May 13th omnibus legislation, the difference in those plans and the actual statutes that make up the laws itself. And I would take my students over and I said, here are the statutes at large. Read the legislation. And in order to grade those papers, I read the legislation. And I said, holy cow. You know, everybody's been wrong. There's a big difference in the New Mexico bill and the Utah bill. And then I wanted to find out, well, why? How did this get in there? Well, the fourth time through giving this course, I sort of changed the format a little, and I had students write on individual pieces of legislation. So I had a wonderful student named Justin McDonald. This guy Hal set for us. He was a wonderful guy. He wrote a paper on House consideration of the Texas-New Mexico border dispute, and this was the sort of at the center of this dispute about the Compromise of 1850. And he turned up that this got in the bill because Robert Toombs of Georgia, at the last minute when this legislation was being considered, introduced this resolution with this clause that I said that no citizen of the United States residing in said territory can be deprived of life, liberty, or property without except by the judgment of his peers or the laws of the land. Then there was a semicolon, and the next clause of this amendment that he proposed, and the laws of the land shall be construed as the common law regarding slavery in every colony prior to July 4, 1776. That is when slavery was legal everywhere. And Northerners jumped all over this, and they voted out the second clause, but the first clause went in, and without that, this has a distinctly anti-slavery tilt. You see, it says legislatures can pass laws that deprive people of their slave property if they want to. There's one other paper that came out of that I would mention. This is just, I'm not touting you, all these people are lawyers now. What do you expect from undergraduate students? But I had a young woman named Jane Limley in the same seminar who, she wrote a paper on the framing of the Fugitive Slave Act. This sort of gets lost in the shuffle, and I won't bore you with all the details. But she found out stuff that nobody knew. Nobody knew. I would go to conventions and I said, "Did you know this about that? Did you know that?" And people said, "No. How on earth did you find that out?" And this young woman had the wit. She didn't find anything. Everybody had gone through the record of 1850 itself, but she had the wit to start looking at 1851 and 52 when people stood up and they said, "This is what really happened back there." The mystery of this is that the bill, what becomes the Fugitive Slave Act, was introduced in early January. It was reported out of the Senate Judiciary Committee before January ended in 1850, yet it was not enacted until August, or actually it was September when it went through the House. And the question is, and people asked on the floor, Lewis Cass of Michigan, in August of 1850, "We were ready to vote for this bill back in January. Why have you been sitting on it?" And why they were sitting on it had everything to do with cowing these Southern Democrats from the Deep South, cowing border state senators into going along with legislation they wanted. It was part of a leverage deal that they were working out, but nobody knew this, and this young woman found it out, and I just think it's great. So one of the things that I would say that I learned was what good work students could do. Let me just talk about a few other things that I found interesting. One of the things I found out doing research, which may interest some of you here, I suspect, was on so boring a topic as the tariff. The Whig Party, of course, like the Republicans in the 19th century, was known as proponents of protective tariffs. And everybody knows, and you think of this protectionism as being associated with New England textile manufacturers and Pennsylvania iron manufacturers, and it was always manufacturing interests that wanted protective tariffs to protect them from foreign competition. And as a gloss to win further popular support for this, they would say, "We're protecting the wages of American workers from pauper European labor. The only way we can keep up wage scales is to have a protective tariff." And indeed, Whigs made arguments like that. But what I found, both in congressional speeches and in particularly a remarkable collection of letters that Daniel Webster collected when he wanted to make a case for not lowering the tariff as dramatically as the Democrats wanted to in 1846, and he had businessmen all around the country polled. What I found that I didn't know anything about was what really mattered to businessmen, and to many Whigs, was the connection of tariff rates to interest rates, to the money supply and the cost of borrowing money. And the argument was that the nation's money supply then was government-minted gold and silver coins, but the real circulating currency were all these privately issued banknotes that were supposed to be backed by specie reserves. And the Whig argument was, but particularly the businessmen's argument was, if we lower the tariff, we're going to unbalance trade. More imports are going to come in than exports are going to go out. Gold, you could only buy goods from abroad with specie. The specie reserves of the country are going to flow into Europe. Therefore, you're going to have less money in circulation because you've got laws stipulating the ratio between note issues and specie reserves. With less money in circulation, interest rates are going to go through the roof, and we're going to go out of business because we won't be able to borrow operating capital, what we need to meet weekly and monthly payrolls. I thought that was fascinating. It's a very sophisticated argument, and nobody said that about the tariff, really, and I thought that was fun. Okay, another thing. This has to do, coming back with the compromise of 1850. This was primarily to settle, imagine that I'm holding up, or behind me there's a big map of the United States going from the Atlantic coast over here to California over here. The argument on the compromise of 1850 was something called the Mexican Cession, which extended from the Pacific coast along the 42nd parallel at the modern boundary of Oregon and California, and then essentially over to the Rocky Mountains. It didn't do that, but it came down the Rocky Mountains and then went over to the along the 32nd parallel back to the Pacific. The argument was what to do about slavery in that big chunk of land that we got as a result of the Mexican War, and many Northerners wanted to pass something called the Wilmot Proviso that would ban slavery from that area by congressional statute. Many Southerners said, if Congress ever passes the Wilmot Proviso, we'll secede on the spot. So the compromise was worked out to try to avoid this Wilmot Proviso. But Zachary Taylor, the Whig president, one of my guys, who comes in March of 1849, and Congress is not going to meet till December, he comes up with a plan to try to finesse this territorial conflict by organizing state governments in this area right away to skip the territorial stage altogether, so Congress has nothing to do with slavery in that territory. And thus he sends an emissary named Thomas Butler King down through the Isthmus of Panama and up to California to get California to write a constitution and apply for statehood. He sends an army major who's stationed in Santa Fe to try to get the New Mexicans to write a constitution. And thus he's going to skip the whole territorial phase. He's going to resolve the conflict over slavery extension, unite the country, avert secession. Well, the one problem with that is if you look, or think of this map, right in here, the Rocky Mountains are over here, it's Utah. And there are all these Mormons sitting in Utah. And they said, well, how is he going to escape the territorial issue if he's just going to have California and New Mexico coming as states? And what I found, and I don't know that anybody's ever said this, but what I found was that Taylor had a plan for Utah, and it was a remarkable plan. He sent a guy overland from St. Louis to talk to the Mormons at Salt Lake City and said, why don't you guys become part of the new state of California? He sent this guy around by water to San Francisco to get Californians to write a constitution. The guy, King, that went to California was supposed to wait till he heard from this guy named John Wilson to see what the Mormons would do. And remarkably enough, if we think of the sort of insularity of the Mormons agreed to become part of California. So this guy Wilson sets off overland over the Sierra Nevada with about 20 Mormons who are going to be the Utah delegates to this new constitutional convention in California. But of course, so you're going to think of the size of that state that you would have had if all that was part of California. But of course, by the time he gets there, the convention had been adjourned for 2 months. It takes a long time to get over the Sierra Nevada, even in the summer. So this opportunity was lost out. But I thought that's fascinating. You know, nobody knew that about it. One last thing, and then I'll let questions. One of the things that I learned, and I eventually had my student Tom Flemmer write a paper. I think it was you, Tom, wrote a paper about this. It had to do with the 1852 election, the Whigs' last presidential election. And this was shaping up to be a seriously issueless, meaningless, empty campaign. And then all of a sudden, at the end of 1851, an opportunity opened up to change the whole agenda of that election and to make foreign policy of all things. the central focus of that presidential election. And this, I didn't know anything about this, and this all had to do with a guy that only the real trivia buffs among you will know. It had to do with somebody named Louis Kossuth. Does anybody know who Louis Kossuth was? Louis Kossuth was a Hungarian who helped lead a Hungarian revolution against the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1848. In 1849, when Russian troops intervened to help the Austrians against the Hungarians, he skedaddled to Turkey with his an entourage of about 200 people, leaving all of the other Hungarians be mowed down by firing squads. But he was greeted as a great hero in the United States, and he comes to the United States, and he arrives in December of 1851, and there's nothing like it. It was sort of like the Beatles hitting the shore. So, you know, 50, tens, hundreds of thousands of people in the streets of New York and Philadelphia, everywhere he went, all these people cheering him on. And what he's saying is the United States must abandon its policy of neutrality. They must raise money and give us money for arms to renew the Hungarian Revolution. They must tell Russia that if you intervene this time, we'll insert American troops in Hungary, of all places, to defend liberty, and you must send the American Navy to the Eastern Mediterranean to give teeth to this. And the crowds are loving it. Well, the Whig administration at the time, this is now Millard Fillmore in there, didn't love it. And they said, no dice. And then the guy said, the hell with you. I'm going to go over your heads to the public. And he goes on a speaking tour trying to rouse the population, and particularly the recent immigrant population. Think of the 48ers and the people that had come over here to say, you've got to throw the bums out, throw the Whigs out. You know, they're sticking with neutrality, vote Democratic. And this threatens, so this threatens to be the issue of the campaign, but it has one other serious implication. What the Whigs found out as they looked at these crowds and what was going on in cities, I mean, the guy went to St. Louis, Cincinnati, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, all over, is that when he went out on these demonstrations, Germans are out there cheering like crazy. But Irish Catholics are throwing rotten eggs and tomatoes and things because the Catholic hierarchy in this country saw the Austro-Hungarian Empire as the remnant of the Holy Roman Empire. They saw this Hungarian Revolution as an attack on the Roman Catholic Church. So Irish Catholics are attacking this guy, and since this guy is trying to incite Germans to vote Democratic to throw the Whigs out, the Whigs think, hey, we'll go after the Irish Catholic vote. They're up for grabs, and this would turn out to be one of the fatal tactical mistakes that the Whigs made in 1852, their last presidential election. I think I'm going to stop there. What I was asked to do is not to give a formal lecture that has a sort of beginning and an end and an argument, so much as to talk about why I wrote a history of the American Whig Party, and it is the American Whig Party, not the English Whig Party, and what some of the more interesting or surprising things were that I discovered when I was doing my research. And that, indeed, is what I want to spend most of my time on this evening. But there may be people in this audience that don't have a clue about what the Whig Party was. So I think I'll say something about it before I describe my book. I realize that many of you do probably know what it is, but for those that don't, it would be helpful. The American Whig Party was created in the winter of 1833-34, and it disappeared essentially in 1856. While it existed, it was the political home of people like Henry Clay and Daniel Webster. Abraham Lincoln, the future Republican. Fans of that, or removing Indians from lands. But so you have a real flip-flop. The Whigs were the guys that wanted to use government, and the Democrats were the party that resisted the use of government. Although the party's existence was quite brief, 22 years, it won 2 of the 5 presidential elections it contested. It competed quite evenly with the Democrats in congressional and gubernatorial elections during its history, and it also helped generate levels of popular political interest and voter turnout that really do reveal how anemic political life and interest is today. This was a very different world that these parties operated in. The turnout level in the 1840 presidential election, for example, was 80.2% nationally. It was higher than that rate in 15 of 25 states. It went down to 79.8% in 1844, still pretty high. It plummeted all the way down to 72% in 1848, and at the lowest point it was 69%. We've been barely able to scrape by with over 50% voter turnout in presidential elections for the last, I don't know how many years. It was also very extraordinary in gubernatorial and off-year because there was so much conflict and such sharp partisan differences. It was the conflict between the parties rather than their cooperation that produced public interest in politics. In my book, and it's a very long book, I must say, if anybody's tried to pick it up, let alone try to read it, I attempt to tell the story of this party from its birth, or its origins really, before it came on the scene, to its death and displacement in the presidential election of 1856. Because state governments actually had more impact on people's everyday lives in the antebellum period, and for much of the late 19th century as well, than did Washington. It's a story that I attempt to cover politics in all the states, as well as on the national scene. It focuses on both the internal divisions within the Whig Party, a very shrewd person at Brookings Institute named James Sundquist once wrote that political parties should be conceived of as battlegrounds over which contending factions fight for control. Every party has battles going on within it to get control of it, and I try to pay attention. The president was a member of the Whig Party during its entire existence, but so was Alexander H. Stephens, the future vice president of the Confederacy. He was a loyal Whig, too. We can think of it as the predecessor of the contemporary Republican Party, as the major rival of the Democratic Party in American political life, although, interestingly enough, it was quite different in its relationship to Democrats than the Republicans in the Democratic Party today. The Whigs, though the preferred party, easily the preferred party of the vast majority of the economic and social elite in the country, were the party of big government, the party that wanted to use the government to do things, to develop the economy in order to create greater economic opportunity for individuals, to improve the nation's moral tone by chartering, by having public school systems, by having religious-oriented reform, whereas the Democrats in the antebellum period and throughout the 19th century, for that matter, were the group that always opposed big government. They opposed the use of government for almost anything other than wars of foreign expansion. They were big. Congressional elections, 65 to 70% turnout rates. People were really interested, and the Whig Party, by what it stood for, helped generate this interest, this level of participation, which, as I said, really shows how anemic our political culture is today. And the Whigs managed, along with the Democrats, obviously, they helped achieve this level of popular interest, not by pursuing some goody two-shoes policy of bipartisan cooperation with the Democrats. Let's get together and solve problems for the public interest. They achieved this level of turnout by opposing what the Democratic Party stood for as ruthlessly and as relentlessly as possible. So we come to another kind of difference of 19th century political culture and life today. Commentator after commentator today says the reason people are so turned off by politics, the reason they don't vote, is that they're sick and tired of all this partisan feuding. They just wish the parties would get together and address public problems and solve them. But it's demonstrably clear, however, that in the 19th century, the only reason why there was this turnout level was precisely